Medicine had always been about miracles for me, until it wasn't. Some days it felt more like a lottery, and my patients were the unlucky ones who never drew the winning numbers. I was Dr. Samuel Mercer, a transplant surgeon at Westfield General, and after 15 years of slicing open bodies and stitching them back together, I knew one brutal truth. There were never enough organs. My shift that night had been another exercise in futility. A 9-year-old girl named Emily Rivera had been admitted earlier in the week, stage 4 liver failure. By the time her parents had scraped together the money to get her on the donor list, it was too late. I watched her die with her mother's screams echoing in my ears. I should have been numb to it, but as I stood there in the quiet of the OR, her tiny hand clutching a stuffed rabbit, I felt rage bubbling inside me. "There's always a way," a voice whispered in my mind. It wasn't mine. 2 days later, the whispers became real. I was halfway through reviewing donor applications when I was called to the administrative office. I assumed it was about the Rivera case. Instead, a man I didn't recognize stood at the far end of the room. A polished suit, slick back hair, and a chillingly calm expression. "Dr. Mercer," he said, extending a hand. "My name is Leonard Holt. I'm here to discuss alternatives." "Alternatives to what?" I asked, my skepticism evident. "To the broken system you work in." Holt handed me a file. I flipped it open. My breath caught. Photographs, names, and addresses of donors and recipients as neatly organized as a ledger. Off-the-books transplants. Illegal, immoral, impossible. Yet here it was, proof that someone was offering people a chance at life outside the rigid rules of the system. "This is illegal," I said sharply, tossing the file back onto the desk. Holt didn't flinch. "So is letting a 9-year-old die because a bureaucrat said her turn hadn't come." I wanted to punch him. Instead, I glared. "What do you want from me?" "Your skill," he replied. "Your discretion and your sense of justice, Dr. Mercer. You could save lives, hundreds of them, if you're willing to work outside the lines." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "You're running an underground organ network." "Organ distribution, doctor. Don't confuse us with criminals who exploit the system. We're fixing what's broken." His words felt like poison seeping into my brain. I shoved the file back at him. "Get out," he smirked. "You'll change your mind. It's only a matter of time." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. His words kept replaying, twisting themselves into a grotesque logic that made too much sense. People were dying every day, waiting on lists that stretched into infinity. But this was playing God. And yet, how was that any different from what I already did in the OR? I decided to forget Holt, to bury the encounter. I was a doctor, not a criminal, but the universe had other plans. A week later, I was performing a routine surgery when the call came. An accident victim, late 20s, brain dead, healthy organs. The nurse whispered the details as I closed up my patient. But then came the twist. The family wanted his body sent to a private facility. No organ donation, no records. The paperwork landed on my desk that afternoon, stamped and approved by the hospital. Someone with power had arranged it, and I knew it was Holt. He was already in my orbit, pulling strings I couldn't see. I stared at the paperwork for hours. Did this man have access to the kind of resources that could bypass red tape? The more I thought about it, the clearer something became. If Holt could make this happen, then he wasn't just running an operation. He was controlling life and death, and he wanted me to join him. At 2 a.m., I found myself driving to a downtown warehouse address Holt had slipped into my coat pocket. It was reckless, insane. But the whispers wouldn't leave me alone. The door opened as I approached, and Holt stood waiting inside, a sly smile on his lips. "Ready to save some lives, Dr. Mercer?" When I stepped into that warehouse, it was like walking into another world. Stark white lights buzzed overhead, illuminating rows of steel tables, surgical equipment, and refrigerated units labeled with tags I refused to read. It looked like an operating theater cobbled together in a fever dream, sterile but unsettling. "Welcome to the place where miracles happen," Holt said, his voice filled with misplaced pride as he led me deeper inside. I wanted to turn back, to scream at him for dragging me into this nightmare. But my curiosity, and something darker, pulled me forward. He stopped in front of a refrigerated unit and opened it. Inside was a cooler marked with a bright red tag. For transport. "What's in there?" I asked, trying to mask my disgust. "A liver," Holt replied matter-of-factly. "Donor, accident victim, recipient, a 12-year-old boy in Argentina whose family is paying handsomely to save him." I froze. "Argentina? You're transporting organs internationally? Why limit miracles to borders?" Holt's smile was infuriatingly calm. "The boy will die in weeks without this. No list, no bureaucracy, no waiting. Just action." "You're playing with fire," I shot back. "This is human trafficking." Holt's expression darkened. "What's trafficking, doctor? A wealthy man paying for life? A child getting the gift he deserves? Or letting people rot on a list that favors the rich and well-connected anyway?" I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because in some horrific way, he was right. The donor system was a corrupt machine, lubricated by grief and luck. Patients with money jumped the line. Patients without? They died waiting. I'd seen it 100 times. Holt sensed my hesitation. "You're conflicted. That's good. It means you're still human. But let me show you something." He led me to another cooler, this one unmarked. He cracked it open and my stomach lurched. Inside was a kidney, blackened, decayed, completely useless. "This," he said, holding it up with gloved hands, "was from a desperate man in some back alley. Sold for cash. Promised to save a dying mother. It killed her instead." I stepped back, bile rising in my throat. "What's your point?" "My point is that illegal organ trade happens with or without us. With us, there's accountability, quality, safety." He set the ruined kidney down and turned to me, his voice dropping. "You can save lives, Samuel, or you can keep pretending the system works." The rest of the night passed in a fog. I let him walk me through the process, how the organs were sourced, transported, and transplanted. He told me they used only ethically sound donors, brain-dead patients with consent arranged quietly by families who didn't trust the bureaucracy. He said there was no exploitation, only salvation. It was a carefully rehearsed sales pitch, and it worked. By the time I got home, the sun was rising. My wife, Amanda, was in the kitchen sipping coffee. "You were gone all night," she said, concern shadowing her face. "Emergency case," I lied. She nodded, but her gaze lingered on me too long. Amanda knew when I wasn't telling the truth. She'd seen me at my worst during residency. Bloodshot eyes, broken confidence, operating like a machine. But this was different. Over the next few days, I tried to convince myself that Holt was a lunatic, that his operation would implode without me. I buried myself in work, staying late at the hospital, avoiding calls and questions. But then came the case, a girl barely 15 whose kidneys had failed. Her parents begged me to help, but I knew the truth. She wouldn't live long enough to get to the top of the list. That night, I sat alone in my office, staring at her file. Her eyes, full of pain and hope, haunted me. When I finally picked up my phone, my hands were trembling. I dialed the number Holt had given me. "I'm in," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Good choice, doctor," he replied. "We'll start tomorrow." The next morning, I sat in my car for a full 10 minutes before finally stepping into the hospital. My mind buzzed like an overloaded circuit, the weight of my decision pressing against my chest. I'd crossed a line I'd spent my entire career swearing I would never approach, and there was no coming back. The little girl with the failing kidneys was named Emily. I visited her room that afternoon, the sterile beep of the monitors filling the silence. Her parents were there, her mother sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing Emily's hair, and her father pacing the room, eyes red from sleepless nights and too many tears. "Dr. Hale," the father said, grabbing my hand as soon as I entered. "Please tell us there's something you can do." I forced a smile, though the guilt gnawed at my insides like a parasite. "We're exploring some options. I'll do everything I can." Emily smiled weakly. "Thank you, doctor," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Those words haunted me as I left the room. The parents' hope, the girl's gratitude. Holt's voice echoed in my head. You can save lives, Samuel, or you can keep pretending the system works. Hours later, I met Holt at an empty parking garage downtown. The place stank of mildew and gasoline, the flickering overhead lights creating long, jagged shadows across the cracked concrete. Holt stood by the open back doors of a van, talking to a man I didn't recognize. Mid-40s, thick mustache, eyes that darted around like a caged animal. Dr. Hale, Holt greeted me with his unsettling calm. This is Victor. Logistics. Victor grunted a hello, barely sparing me a glance. His thick gloves were stained, a dark brown I didn't want to investigate further. What are we doing here? I asked, my voice more clipped than I intended. Acquisition, Holt replied as he gestured to the cooler inside the van. A kidney for your patient, Emily. Clean, verified, ready to go. I froze. That fast? Where did this come from? Holt stepped closer, lowering his voice. Do you really want the answer, Sam? Or do you want to save that girl's life? I stared at the cooler, bile rising in my throat. My mind screamed to demand answers, but my heart whispered otherwise. Emily. I saw her face, smiling, fragile, hopeful, and all the doubt fell away. Let's get it done, I said, barely recognizing my own voice. The transplant took place the following night. An after-hours operation with only a skeleton crew of staff I trusted implicitly. I'd told them it was a special arrangement, though the vague wording left questions hanging in the air. The organ was pristine, a perfect match. As I stood over Emily on the operating table, hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through me, I realized I'd never felt this alive. Every move I made felt purposeful, deliberate. When we closed her up, her vitals stable and strong, I knew we'd saved her life, but there was no celebration. The following day, Emily's parents cried tears of joy as they hugged me, their gratitude spilling over into every word. I accepted it with a hollow smile. I told myself I'd done the right thing, the only thing, but a gnawing unease stayed with me. Later that evening, Holt called. She's stable? Yes, I replied curtly. Good. There was a pause. And the parents? Grateful? I gripped the phone tighter. Of course. Why does that matter? Because, Sam, gratitude is a valuable currency. Holt's tone shifted, darkening like a gathering storm. The operation was free for them, but we'll call in a favor later. Don't worry, they won't mind when the time comes. I sat there stunned. You never mentioned that. Holt chuckled softly, the sound sending a chill down my spine. I told you this isn't charity. We save lives, yes, but there's a price. There's always a price. The line went dead, and I stared at the phone, Holt's words ringing in my ears. My hands trembled as realization dawned. I hadn't just saved Emily's life. I'd indebted her family to a man whose morals were as flexible as his operations were illegal. And I had no idea what kind of favor Holt might demand when the time came. The trap was set, and I had walked into it willingly. The next few weeks were a blur, a whirlwind of ethical compromise masked by surgical precision. Emily's recovery was heralded as a miracle in the hospital corridors, and for a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe it was worth it, that bending the rules had served a higher purpose. But Holt wasn't finished with me, and deep down, I knew that the first operation was only the beginning. It started with a second call. I was driving home after another 14-hour shift when Holt's name appeared on my phone screen. My stomach twisted as I pulled over to answer. Sam, Holt's voice oozed with his usual calm control. There's another case, a heart this time. Boy, 10 years old. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, my knuckles pale. Holt, I can't. You can, and you will. His tone remained conversational, but there was an edge to it now, sharp and unforgiving. You saved Emily because you were brave enough to act when the system couldn't. You'll save this boy too. Or do you want to be the reason another kid dies waiting for paperwork to clear? The words hit like a hammer. Holt knew how to weaponize guilt, and he wielded it expertly. I stared out at the darkened street as he spoke again, his voice quieter now, almost coaxing. This is your calling, Sam. You've already seen what we're capable of. We find organs for people who can't afford to wait, who don't have time to wait. You're saving lives. Don't lose sight of that. He hung up before I could reply. I spent the night pacing my living room, the weight of his words pressing against me like a suffocating blanket. Everything in me wanted to say no, to turn away and pretend I'd never answered that first call. But Holt had infected me with a brutal truth. People were dying every day because the system was broken. If I turned my back now, wasn't I complicit? The next night, I was back in the parking garage, the air heavy with gasoline fumes and my own dread. Victor was waiting by the van again, his gloved hands resting on a cooler identical to the first. I didn't ask where the heart had come from. I couldn't bring myself to know. "Let's get this over with," I said flatly, and Victor smirked as he handed over the cooler. This time, I didn't even hesitate. The procedure was another covert operation, performed after hours with the same trusted team. My hands worked mechanically, my mind numb to the moral quagmire I was sinking into. The boy's heart began beating strong and steady within his chest, and as I stood over him, sweat dripping down my forehead, I told myself I was still a good man. The line between justification and corruption blurred a little more that night, but the price of my decisions was beginning to show. My sleep became a patchwork of nightmares. Cold operating tables, blood-stained gloves, disembodied organs, and ice-filled coolers. I started avoiding mirrors, afraid of the hollow-eyed stranger I was becoming. Then came the news that shattered my fragile justification. I was sitting in my office reviewing post-op notes when a breaking story lit up the TV in the corner. Police are investigating the death of a 29-year-old man found in an abandoned warehouse. Authorities suspect organ trafficking is at play. I froze, my pulse pounding in my ears. The image on the screen showed a blurry photo of a gaunt, lifeless face. I didn't know him, but I didn't need to. My mind filled in the blanks. Another nameless victim whose parts had been harvested, parceled out to people like me for the greater good. I shut off the TV and sank into my chair, head in my hands. This wasn't what I'd signed up for. I'd been so fixated on saving lives that I'd ignored the trail of bodies left behind. Holt's operation wasn't some altruistic crusade. It was a machine, grinding up the vulnerable and spitting out organs for profit. And I was part of it. I barely made it home that night, my hands trembling as I unlocked my front door. I poured myself a drink and stared at the glass for hours, wrestling with the truth. I'd become everything I once despised, a doctor who had betrayed his oath, his morals, and himself. But it wasn't just me anymore. I'd dragged others into this. The surgical team I'd sworn to secrecy, the families who believed I was a miracle worker. And Holt. Holt owned me now. If I tried to back out, I knew exactly what would happen. The phone rang again. Holt's name glowed on the screen like a brand. I stared at it, my chest tight, as the ringing echoed through the empty room. I didn't answer the call. Holt's name disappeared from the screen, but the silence left behind was no comfort. I knew he'd be back. He always came back. The man was relentless, a shadow that seemed to stretch over every part of my life now. For a moment, I considered smashing the phone against the wall, breaking the connection forever. But I knew better. You didn't just ignore Holt. He didn't tolerate disobedience. Hours later, my doorbell rang. My gut twisted. It was past midnight, and I wasn't expecting anyone. The drink in my hand rattled as I set it on the table, listening. The doorbell chimed again. I tiptoed to the peephole and froze. Victor. He was standing there in a black leather jacket, hands tucked casually in his pockets, like he had all the time in the world. His smile didn't reach his eyes. I swallowed hard and cracked the door open just enough to meet his gaze. "What are you doing here?" My voice came out sharper than I'd intended. "You didn't pick up." His thick accent made every word sound heavier. "Holt is waiting. You should answer when he calls, doctor." "Sam," I felt my pulse race. "I told him I needed time." Victor's smile widened just slightly. "Time? Time is a luxury. You, my friend, do not have it." He took a step closer, and I instinctively gripped the doorframe. "The next operation is in 2 days. You'll be there, yes?" "What if I say no?" I asked, surprising even myself. The grin vanished. Victor tilted his head slightly, considering me like I was a specimen under glass. "No is not an option. Holt doesn't ask twice." I slammed the door before he could say another word, locking it and leaning my forehead against the wood. My chest heaved as I tried to calm the panic clawing at my throat. Victor didn't knock again, but I didn't feel relief. The message had been delivered, loud and clear. I didn't sleep. Instead, I paced the apartment, replaying every choice I'd made to get here. It had started with a single decision. One life saved. Now I was entangled in something I couldn't escape. By morning, I'd made up my mind. If I couldn't stop Holt, I'd expose him. It was the only way to burn the entire operation to the ground. But how? Holt was smart. He'd covered his tracks well. I needed proof, something undeniable that I could take to the authorities. I started digging. The hospital records were my first stop. Every black market transplant Holt had pushed through left a shadow in our legitimate system. Anomalous gaps, late-night surgeries, drugs unaccounted for in inventory. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I spent hours pulling files, cross-referencing patient names with donor histories. My stomach turned when I realized how many lives were tied to Holt's network. Recipients, families, surgeons like me who had no idea what they were involved in. At work, I kept my head down, pretending everything was normal. But paranoia crept into my thoughts. Every corner held a phantom. Every glance from a coworker felt suspicious. I jumped at the slightest noise, convinced Victor or one of Holt's men was watching. Then as I combed through another stack of files, I found it. A name. Victor Ballin. It was buried in a donor log from 2 months earlier, an entry flagged as irregular by the automated system. The donor had been a 34-year-old man reported missing in Romania. Cause of death? Accident. But the organs had been harvested before the official time of death, sent to clients across Europe. It was a smoking gun. A donor killed for his parts, and Holt had signed off on it. I sat back, the paper shaking in my hands. It was all the proof I needed. Clear, cold, and damning. I tucked the document into a folder, my heart pounding. But as I stood to leave, my office phone rang. I froze. Slowly, I picked up the receiver. Sam. It was Holt. His voice was calm, deliberate. You've been busy, haven't you? My blood ran cold. I don't know what you're talking about, I replied, forcing steadiness into my voice. Holt chuckled softly. Don't insult me. I've seen what you're doing. It's disappointing, really. I thought you understood the vision. I gripped the phone tighter. You're killing people. They were already dead to the world, he replied, his voice sharp now. You're a doctor, Sam. You know what life is worth. This operation saves people who matter. People with power. You should be proud. I'm done, I said through gritted teeth. There was a pause. You're not done. You'll never be done. But since you've forgotten who you work for, Victor will remind you. I suggest you open your front door. My breath caught. I turned toward the door. Someone was standing on the other side, their shadow visible through the frosted glass. I dropped the phone, my heart hammering in my chest. The handle turned. The door opened slowly. My first instinct was to bolt. Out the window, through the fire escape, anywhere but here. But I was frozen, caught like an animal in headlights as Victor stepped inside. His leather jacket creaked as he moved, a faint smile plastered on his face. The kind of smile predators wear when they know their prey has no chance of escaping. Sam, he said softly, almost mockingly, why do you make things difficult? I couldn't find my voice. The folder with the incriminating document was clenched tightly in my hand, its edges digging into my palm. Victor's eyes flicked to it immediately, and his smile disappeared. What's that? He asked, his tone darkening. Nothing. I tried to slide it behind me, but he stepped closer, towering over me now. My legs felt like rubber, my body on the verge of betraying me. Hand it over, Victor demanded, holding out one gloved hand. I didn't move. You can't intimidate me into backing down. Victor sighed, the kind of sigh a parent gives a misbehaving child. I don't have to intimidate you, Sam. I just need to remind you of the consequences. He reached into his jacket, and for a heart-stopping second, I thought he'd pull a gun. Instead, he withdrew his phone and swiped at the screen, holding it up to me. A photo appeared. It was my sister. Anna. She was walking out of her apartment building, earbuds in, completely oblivious to the man with a camera tailing her. My throat tightened. I hadn't spoken to her in weeks, hadn't dared involve her in this mess. Leave her out of this, I said, my voice hoarse. That's up to you. Victor's expression didn't change. We're all reasonable people here. You cooperate, she stays safe. You keep digging, and accidents happen. I swallowed hard, anger and fear swirling in my chest. Holt sent you. He sent me to bring you back to your senses. You've lost sight of the bigger picture, Sam. Victor's eyes darted toward the folder again. Whatever's in that file, it doesn't matter. You're in this too deep. If you try to take Holt down, you'll take yourself with him. Think about that. I said nothing. He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'll make this simple. You hand over the folder, you show up at the next operation, and we forget this little misunderstanding ever happened. If you don't, he tapped the phone screen again, and Anna's face reappeared. Well, you get the idea. He held out his hand again. For a second, I considered giving him the file, letting all of this go. I could buy myself time, maybe even figure out another way to expose Holt. But as I looked at Victor, something inside me hardened. I'd spent too long being afraid, too long cleaning up the blood Holt spilled. If I gave him the file now, I'd never get another chance to stop him. I need to think, I said, buying myself precious seconds. Victor studied me, then nodded slowly. You've got until tomorrow, but if you're not back on track by then... He let the threat hang in the air as he turned and walked out, leaving the door ajar. As soon as he was gone, I crumpled to the floor, the file still clutched in my shaking hands. My mind raced. Holt's reach was deeper than I'd imagined, his power absolute. He had resources, men like Victor, and he wasn't afraid to use them. But he'd just made a mistake. By threatening Anna, he'd given me a reason to fight harder. I grabbed my phone and called Anna, my heart pounding as it rang. Hey, big brother, she answered cheerfully. Anna, listen to me carefully. I kept my voice steady, hiding my panic. You need to pack a bag and leave town, right now. What? Why? Just trust me. Don't tell anyone where you're going, and don't come back until I say it's safe. Her tone shifted. Sam, what's going on? I'll explain later. Please just go. There was silence for a moment before she whispered, Okay. I hung up and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling. Holt had forced my hand. I couldn't run. Not now. The only way out was through, and I needed allies. People I could trust. I thought of Dr. Patel. He'd been there during the first questionable surgeries, growing just as uneasy as I had before stepping back. I wasn't sure if he'd help me, but he was my best shot. I grabbed the file and my car keys, heading to Patel's house before Victor could decide to double back. When I arrived, Patel answered the door with tired eyes, his expression shifting to alarm when he saw me. Sam, what's going on? I need your help, I said, holding up the folder. I'm going after Holt. His brow furrowed. Sam, that's suicide. You know what he's capable of. I don't have a choice anymore. He threatened my sister. I can't let him keep doing this. We started this mess together, Patel, and I need your help to end it. Patel hesitated, his gaze flicking to the folder. I could see the gears turning in his mind. Finally, he sighed and opened the door wider. Come inside. I stepped into his house, clutching the file like a lifeline. For the first time in months, I wasn't alone. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Tomorrow I'd face Holt. One way or another, this was coming to an end. The following morning, I felt like I was walking a tightrope with no net below. The sun barely rose when I pulled into the hospital parking lot, but every movement felt amplified. Every glance from a nurse, every murmured word in the hallway. I kept expecting Victor to appear from the shadows or for Holt to call and remind me of his control. But the hospital was quiet, almost indifferent to the war raging inside me. Dr. Patel and I had spent most of the night going over the file and sketching a plan. We need someone outside the hospital, Patel had said, his voice hushed, paranoia etched on his face. Someone with authority. Police, journalists, anyone who can take Holt down. Not yet, I replied. We need stronger proof, something they can't deny. That's what brought me back to work today, pretending like nothing had changed. My shift was routine, a blur of patient charts and consultations. But under the surface, I was waiting. Holt had promised another operation soon, and I knew it would be my chance. Late in the afternoon, I got the call. Sam! Holt's voice purred through the phone like oil slicked over gravel. Tonight's the night. You'll meet Victor at the usual place. It's a liver this time. Clean, perfect condition. The recipient is waiting, and you're the man to make it happen. I clenched the phone so hard my knuckles went white. I'll be there. Good man. Holt hung up, leaving me staring into the void of my empty office. This was it, my moment. I decided last night that tonight would be my final cut, the last time I ever set foot in this nightmare. Patel and I had laid the groundwork. After the surgery, he would call an investigative journalist he knew, a pit bull who specialized in exposing corruption. I would record everything, the organ's delivery, the procedure, the quiet removal of any evidence. If I went down, I'd take Holt and his entire operation with me. At midnight, I arrived at the parking garage. Victor was already there, leaning against the van with his usual smug expression. "You're late, doctor," he said, opening the doors and revealing the familiar cooler inside. I swallowed back the bile rising in my throat. "Traffic?" I lied. Victor smirked, unimpressed. "Let's move. The window's tight." The drive to the warehouse felt eternal. I sat silently in the passenger seat as Victor hummed along to some distorted tune on the radio. The streets were empty, the darkness pressing against the windows like a living thing. I replayed the plan in my mind, every step drilled into me like a mantra. When we arrived, Holt was waiting inside, dressed in one of his immaculate suits, the sheen of the fabric almost blinding under the surgical lights. "Punctuality is important, doctor." "Mercer," he said, smiling that reptilian smile of his. "I trust you're ready?" I nodded, forcing myself to meet his gaze. "Let's get it over with." The operation itself was clinical, mechanical. My hands moved with practiced ease as I worked, but my mind was a million miles away. I imagined Anna safe somewhere, far from here. I imagined Holt in handcuffs, his empire crumbling. I focused on those images to steady my breathing. When I finished, I stepped back, peeling off my gloves. "The liver's secure, the boy will recover." Holt clapped his hands together, his expression full of false cheer. "Excellent work, as always. You truly are the best, Sam." I didn't respond. My throat was dry, my heart hammering in my chest. Holt's praise felt like acid on my skin. I glanced at the clock. Patel would be making the call any minute now. I'd left my phone in my car, its recorder running. Everything, the delivery, Holt's orders, the surgery, was on tape. All I had to do was get out. "Leaving so soon?" Holt asked as I stepped toward the door. "I need rest," I muttered. "It's been a long night." Holt nodded, though something in his gaze made my blood run cold. "Of course. But before you go, Sam, there's something I need to ask." I froze. "What?" Holt stepped closer, his calm demeanor faltering for the first time. "Why is your car missing?" My breath caught. "What?" "Your car," he repeated, his voice like a blade. "Victor noticed it's gone. Strange, isn't it? You always park in the same place. Unless, of course, you're up to something." My stomach dropped. I forced a laugh, trying to play it off. "You think I'm plotting something? I had a flat tire earlier. I had to take a cab." Holt's eyes narrowed. "You're lying." Before I could respond, Victor grabbed my arm, his grip like iron. I struggled, panic flooding my veins. Holt's voice cut through the chaos, cold and merciless. "Check the car, now." Victor shoved me toward a chair, his hands pinning me down. I fought, but he was stronger. Holt turned away, speaking quietly to someone on the phone. "Find it, and if you find anything—" His gaze flicked to me, a cruel smile forming. "We'll handle it." The minutes that followed were an eternity. My chest rose and fell in sharp gasps as I listened to Holt's men search the lot. My mind raced for an escape plan, but there was none. I'd played my hand, and they'd caught me. Then the call came. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw Holt's expression shift, first to confusion, then to fury. He turned back to me, his face red with anger. "You've betrayed me, Sam." I didn't reply. I couldn't. Holt nodded to Victor, who cracked his knuckles menacingly as he stepped forward. "Make sure he never talks." Victor grabbed me by the collar, dragging me toward the back of the warehouse. I fought, screaming, But no one would hear me in this forgotten corner of the city. Holt's voice echoed behind me as the darkness swallowed me whole. You should have stayed loyal, doctor.